Hi everybody, welcome again to our research methods series. Today we're going to be talking about media and textual analysis, and this lecture is based on chapter 9 in Charlene Hesse-Bieber's book Qualitative Research, but this chapter was actually written by Heather McIntosh and Lisa Kuklantz. First, let's define our terms. Content analysis means analyzing what's included and also excluded within a body of texts. And then when we say texts, we mean not only written text, but also images, audiovisual texts, or any kind of multimedia texts. And we can also refer to performances as text. The main questions and goals of content analysis and textual analysis are often informed by a discipline called cultural studies, which is really concerned with understanding ideology and understanding maybe how we can even change things in society through looking at how we represent them in our public texts and maybe changing the way that we do that, or at least becoming aware of it. So it often mixes qualitative and quantitative approaches, and we're going to talk more about how that's done in a little bit. And another thing about content analysis is that you don't have to work with human subjects. It's so-called unobtrusive because you're getting data from sources other than people directly. A quantitative textual analysis or content analysis will often look at a huge corpus of text, a huge body of texts, and use software to analyze what's going on in them. And a goal is to develop statistically significant results here. So the example that we get in our book is how our presidential candidates described in news coverage, and then how you might go about doing a textual analysis to figure that out in a quantitative way would be to collect articles, for example, of these descriptions, find patterns among the words and phrases using software, and then that software will count up the kinds of patterns to see what is most frequent there. A qualitative style of textual analysis, on the other hand, will use a smaller corpus of texts, and what it is that you analyze is going to be guided by your research questions. So the example here would be a question like, how do attitudes toward the gender, perceived power, and relative value of candidates affect how they're described in news coverage? And then you would look at a smaller body of articles and focus on how the candidates are labeled, what kind of metaphors are used for each of the candidates, and what kind of quotes are attributed to them in the articles. Then you would analyze those things for meanings related to gender, power, and value regarding those candidates. So these are just examples of how you might do it. Your own research questions would determine the kind of analysis that you'd want to do. The advantage of a quantitative analysis is that it can give you statistically significant data. But a quantitative analysis is often done in conjunction with a qualitative analysis because a quantitative analysis alone can sometimes come out sounding like it's stating the obvious. You might confirm a theory this way with the statistical significance that you get, but you get really into the deeper meaning when you go into a qualitative analysis that your quantitative analysis has helped you get to. So qualitative analysis really gets at the meaning. And content analysis as a method proceeds from the idea that all texts have multiple meanings, they're polysemic, and that also those meanings are not going to be infinite in any given place and time. So yes, they can theoretically possibly be infinite, but context, history, and the social norms of when the text is produced and also the social norms of when the text is interpreted place limits on the given range of meaning that a particular text can have. So qualitative analysis gets at the subtleties of these meanings, and it also involves more of your, as the researcher's, interpretations. When you're choosing which text to analyze, assuming that you want to start out with kind of a large corpus of texts, the first thing you're going to do is choose the database, or what's going to be the major corpus of the texts, and then you're going to delimit the text that you're going to use within that. So first you would choose maybe something like one single database, one single social media platform, or one single text type. And then within that, you would use your research questions to guide you in choosing which text you're actually going to analyze among those. In order to analyze the text, if you start with a quantitative analysis, and even with a bigger qualitative analysis, one thing you might want to look into is software like Atlas TI or In Vivo that allows you to find patterns across the texts, and then you can also annotate them. So when you code them, you're also doing some qualitative analysis. But of course, if you're using a small number of texts, you don't necessarily need this kind of software to find the patterns. Rather, you yourself would develop categories as you read them or as you watch them if they're audiovisual. And then you note that these categories are not just going to jump out at you. It's going to be like you read that and you say, oh, that's interesting. And then you read some more and you say, oh, I think I find a pattern, and then you'll go back and forth between your questions and looking at the text again until you're satisfied with the themes that you've found out and the categories that you're going to use to analyze them. So it is kind of a dialectic process of developing what your questions are, what your categories and themes are going to be. Then you're going to look in the texts for evidence supporting those categories, and you collect it to form your descriptive argument. Then once you've formed that argument, you're going to connect it to your claims for significance. So why does this matter? Even if it doesn't give us information about a general case, it can still be valuable as unique and special in and of itself. I mentioned that textual analysis doesn't count as human subjects research, but it does still require us to take ethics into account. And these are going to depend on the type of content and the setting in which we find the content. So, like, what about YouTube comments, for example? They're not always anonymous, even though they're publicly posted. So it raises the question for us, what level of consent to us remediating these comments? How do those people think they're giving by posting comments on YouTube? Then another issue is that of intellectual property. So this is more for publication. If you wanted to republish a still from a video or a particular image in your article that you publish, then you're going to have to deal with licensing. And you're going to have to get permissions for that. So that's also an ethical consideration. We need to do those things legally and also ethically to acknowledge others' work. And then there's also just the question of how does this textual analysis relate to the larger study and its context. So this is quite possible to bring up some ethical considerations depending on what kind of study you're doing. So we had two example articles to read, and the first one was one that makes use of a large corpus of texts and does a quantitative analysis first, then dials in to do a qualitative analysis. This was Amy Catalinek's From Pork to Policy, The Rise of Programmatic Campaigning in Japanese Elections. So her question was, does changing the electoral system change how candidates campaign? And she goes on in the article to say that, well, political theory says yes, it does, and experience in Japan suggests that these candidates, after the switch in types of electoral system in 1995, they moved away from pork, or focusing on special interest groups that would support them, to policy, or focusing on programmatic topics like national security. So this article is really about finding a new way to test that theory and their hypotheses empirically. And how they decide to do it is they get the candidates' manifestos from every serious candidate, and in the article they define what they count as a serious candidate, who competed in the 3 elections immediately prior to Japan's 1995 electoral reform, and then the 5 elections immediately after. So they end up having 7,497 manifestos, and initially they do their analysis quantitatively with software through a process called LDA, which is a probabilistic topic modeling process. And just a little bit about how that works. They set the number of topics, and then the software counts up the words that are related to those topics to using a probability model to say, okay, these words probably go with this topic. And Once they do that, you have a map of what are the topics that they talk about the most. So then once they find that, they do an in-depth qualitative analysis of each topic. So what's happening here is the quantitative analysis is helping them point the way among all those manifestos to what it is that they should be focusing on qualitatively. And in order to do this well, you also have to have some knowledge of Japanese politics and what's been going on. So you need the historical knowledge, you need the political theory knowledge, and you need the ethnographic knowledge to be able to do this analysis well. So they come up with some fascinating detailed results that do confirm their main hypothesis and also show us how useful this method can be. Our second example article is a comparative film analysis, and it's by Swikrita Daura and Devarshi Prasad Nath. They are looking at cinematic landscapes of Northeast India through an eco-critical lens. So their question is, how do Bollywood films represent the diverse border regions of Northeast India through landscape? But when they ask that question, they're not asking how all Bollywood films do. They're taking two that are supposedly set in Northeast India and looking at how they do it. So they come up with the argument that how films treat landscape also relates to how they treat the people of the areas, and in this case, the way they treat the landscape perpetuates stereotypes about the people in the region. And they want you to know that Northeast India is it's a really diverse region, and it's a lot closer to Southeast Asia in terms of culture than it is to what's stereotypically considered the rest of India. So even Indians stereotype this region a lot. And this is why they're looking at it in this way, because they want to see how public culture in India is portraying this particular region that's kind of misunderstood. So their method is looking at how landscape works in both films. So what role does it play in the narrative? And they find out that one of them, the first one, uses landscape in more symbolic ways to further the narrative, and the other one has the landscape as the setting in which the action takes place. So both of them do end up portraying different stereotypes of the Northeast and don't do all that much to challenge them. The second film, where the landscape is really the setting for the action, it's not even shot in the Northeast, so it ends up taking stereotypical aspects of Northeast life and using that to stand in for the Northeast itself. So you can see how by comparing these two articles, the level of detail and the type of detail that are used in each of them is different. It's based on their research questions and also the way that they use textual content analysis. So both of these are textual analysis. Both of these are content analysis. Both of these are media analysis, whatever word you want to use for it. But there's a broad range of things that you can do within this method, and there's a broad range of ways in which they all can be valid.